So tonight I thought we could start with a little discussion about feelings. So I'd like to hear what you think about kind of what are feelings and what's your relationship to feelings? How do feelings influence your life? Probably should have given you some time to think about this because it's kind of a big question. But this is somewhat better. It's like what's your first instinct? Don't think about it too much. Just yeah, I mean, what do you think about? What comes to mind when you think about feelings? How do they affect you? What's your relationship with them? Just kind of what do you think about feelings?
It's funny to say, what do you think about feelings? Um,
Yeah.
uh, it's kind of the opposite. It's just, um, it's feelings. It's what you feel, and it's not necessarily something that you can rationalize or not. I guess I've always been told that I'm too sensitive or overly sensitive, which I take to mean that I feel things kind of deeply, and but it can also be somewhat indulgent too. I think you can kind of take that and run with it a little bit. And so there's got to be a balance of, having feelings, maybe being, buoyed or beaten down by those feelings. But I think to keep it in perspective, that it's kind of like a tide coming in and out in a way, because the very same thing could happen on another day and you wouldn't feel hurt, or you wouldn't feel, um, you know, in quite the same way. So I think it just depends on the day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if that's what came to mind.
Cool. Yeah. Great answer. How about you, Carla? Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think it was like, there are feelings like how I feel and emote, right? Then there are times where feelings can be about, an opinion, right? Like how you feel about a thing. And then there's also just like the deep knowingness around like gut feelings or your deepest intuition, or even the outcome of an exchange with another person, whether you end up feeling good as a result of the interaction or lousy about it. And then also just how you can change your feelings depending on how you think about it, right? So it's kind of a loaded question. So I think
Mhm.
there are a lot of layers to it. And there are times where you just kind of want, sometimes the right answer is I just gotta feel into that a little bit, because it's like, where are the layers and where am I going to land and meet, this situation or this question or this person. So yeah. And then of course I keep thinking of that 70s song Feelings, so which is just kind of a karaoke favorite, but I'll spare you. But it's in my mind.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Great answer. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's no right or wrong answer. I Googled this a little bit because I started thinking about, I'm like, well, yeah, what exactly are feelings? And I looked in some psychology articles, and like you were saying, Carla, the professionals, the psychologists, they kind of define it in layers of complexity. Like you were saying, there's the very basic feelings that we're kind of born with, you know, sensing hunger, sensing hot and cold, the things they're often associated with your physical expressions, right? You kind of can't help but react to things. So I mean, there's our very basic reactions to physical stimuli, things like that. And then as we get older, they get a little bit more complicated, and like you said, they get layered, like kind of physical sensations become more part of mental processes, and then you get more complicated emotions and sometimes emotions can get combined together, and you have layers of emotion. So yes, definitely a very complicated uh, whole lot of stuff going on there with feelings. Yeah. Um, and it's great what both of you said, that um, even though feelings are very important, and I think, and I've talked a lot about the importance of feeling our feelings and being in tune with our feelings, and especially because a lot of us grow up to and learn to kind of repress our feelings or ignore them, especially the negative feelings, and or even all, like you were saying, Gina, if we're told we're too sensitive, we learn to distrust our feelings or just try to kind of stuff them down or ignore them. So it's very important to get in touch with our feelings if we're cut off from them, and be able to feel them as they arise and be in tune with them and allow them to process through our bodies. But at some point, we also kind of do need to critically evaluate them, because um, from an evolutionary standpoint, feelings, I've talked about this a little bit before, but essentially feelings, if you look at them from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, feelings are kind of like cattle prods that natural selection uses to guide us either towards good behaviors or away from bad behaviors. And that sounds pretty good on the surface, but like I've talked about before, or so I don't know if you guys remember from when I talked about this before, but what's the one goal of natural selection? Do you remember when I talked about this?
It's the propagation of of the species.
Yeah, exactly. Like the only thing natural selection cares about is making us have as many offspring as possible. And so that's how feelings evolve. They evolve to steer us towards behaviors that maximize our chances of having offsprings and away from behaviors that minimize our chances to have offspring. And so in some cases, those align well with our physical health, because being healthy, being strong and fit, that often maximizes our chances to have offspring. So a lot of our feelings are geared towards things that are going to be healthy for us. But like I think, like I've talked before, we evolved in a very different environment from what we currently live in. Modern humans, physically we evolved something like, depending on who you ask, like 12,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. There's varying estimates, but a long time ago, when very different environment, when we were hunters and gatherers, and it was a struggle to find food. And so some of those behaviors and some of those, the wiring in our brains no longer function to guide us towards good behaviors. So I think I've talked about sugar here. I know you heard this a couple weeks ago, Carla. I've talked about how sugar has become misaligned in our modern day, because that, were you here when I talked about this one time, Gina, about how sugar circumvents our evolutionary um, circuitry? Well, so sugar, we're back when we were evolving, the only source of sugar was fruit, and fruit is healthy for us. There's lots of antioxidants and vitamins and nutrients, so fruit's really good for us. And so when we evolved, it made sense in evolutionary terms to make sugar highly attractive to us. And that's why it directly stimulates our release. So when you eat sugar, it gives you this jolt of dopamine, just like hardcore drugs do. Because back in the day, it made sense for us to kind of treat fruit like crack, because it wasn't available very often, and it's very good for us. So when it was available, it made sense for us to be motivated to eat as much of it as we can. So that made sense 12,000 years ago. But now, with the invention of junk food, that no longer makes sense and no longer serves us, because it still feels good to eat sugar. But now, with the availability of empty calories and junk food and candy, now it feels good to us to do things that are bad for our health. It feels good to eat candy. It feels good to eat cookies. But if we just listen to that instinct, only if we only listen to that feeling of how it feels when we eat sugar, we're motivated to eat, gorge on sugar. And This is a big reason for a big contributing factor to the obesity epidemic right now because our brains are maladapted for this modern environment. So that's
And
one example.
it's a different kind of sugar though too. I
Mhm.
mean, fruit is one thing and you get that sugar, but the sugar that people are binging on,
Right.
just I
Pure
think about
sugar.
a
Yeah.
Coca-Cola, that has so much sugar in it and people drink several a day and that's just not sugar. It's corn syrup basically.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. It's just pure refined glucose that, yeah, just
Yeah.
goes straight into the bloodstream. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just one example where our feelings no longer serve us, right? Because it's still, and I struggle with sugar myself sometimes too, because it feels really good to eat sugar. You get that straight dopamine rush. And so that's one place where we have to take a critical look at our feelings and see, is this feeling really serving me in this situation? And so that's one kind of simple example just on uh, from one of these more simple emotions, just having to do with hunger and taste. But this also carries forward into more complex emotions, things that happen in relationships and things like that. So, for example, a lot of the coping mechanisms that we develop, or that some people develop in response to stressful childhoods, those those develop based on feelings. But then the feelings associated. So one example is people that grow up with abusive parents, and they associate love. They come to associate love with pain. So because love and pain are kind of they always experience those together, pain can start to feel good to someone who develops a coping mechanism like this, and so that can lead them into more painful situations that feels good on one level. And so that's just another example of where we need to critically examine our feelings, and especially anytime we have very strong feelings, that's that's a good time to take a take a breath and take a moment and sit and kind of critically evaluate our feelings.